We are live. It's another great day. I don't know about you, Paul, but it's a great day in Atlanta. How's the weather?
Beautiful out here in Denver. Thanks for asking.
So, welcome to have Paul Stout, Field CTO from VisiCore, with us today. Paul is just blown away expert in security and SIM and data pipelines, and so always happy to have Paul on the stream. We want to today. We want to talk about something people are always struggling with, and it's about knowing your data. How do you know your data? What's in your data? What are the problems? Do you have an understanding of what's there or what's missing? It's something just run across all the time. Paul, where do you see this in your practice? Do you find customers generally have a good grasp of what's in their data, or do you see that that's an issue?
I find that it can often start that way, but as an environment progresses, you'll ultimately have different people working in it. Sometimes you'll have more than one services partner in there, and you will get to a point where we don't really know everything that's going through there. Or if we do know all the data that's going in, at a certain point, we're not entirely sure how it's being used downstream or if it's even relevant at all at a certain point. And so that starts to create challenges when you go to, say, renew your system of analysis or renew your Cribl will, because any prudent decision maker is going to ask what the value we're getting out of it, what the value of the additional spend is.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, I mean that's what matters. And this is where we start asking customers like a frequently talk about data strategy. And the idea is, what data are you collecting? Why are you collecting it? What are you doing with the data?
Exactly.
And these are all big issues. Too oftentimes over the years, and I know Paul's seen this, is it's like, okay, we're going to collect everything. It's the idea of just that disease known as log it all. And companies are like, oh, we cannot afford log it all. So now we have to start trimming, and then you have to start, what are you trimming and why? And it gets you to an endless kind of doom loop where you're just constantly trimming data, and oh, am I trimming the wrong things? And this is what started finally getting the idea of how can we start tiering our data. So, for example, for your SIM, how do I put data that's related to my detections and immediate response in my SIM and everything else somewhere else, preferably in your data lake? And this is where, but this thing is, then how do you know what's related to your detections? How do you know what's related to compliance? How do you know what's related to this type of data, this type of use case? And this is where that idea of knowing your data and classifications is so important, because if you don't have answers to these questions, knowing how to tier your data gets really hard. Paul, do you have anything you want to share there?
Yeah, you're right. And some things it becomes easy kind of to trim it down, but knowing the data, it can also become difficult to route all of that. And I've seen some clients' environments where you've got a routing table that scrolls 2 or 3 pages,
Right.
and it's all done manually. And there's no clean way to tell if you change something upstream if it's going to affect a route downstream. And not only, we talked about the expense of sending it to the system analysis, the SIM. We talked about storing it in the data lake. A lot of organizations are going to have compliance requirements to maintain a full fidelity copy of those events. And stuff like that is even better suited for like a glacier, like a deep freeze long-term storage on that. So there's absolutely value in that. And you're right. We say we want to log it all, and that's been the story of several prominent systems of analysis out there. But the reality is you just can't do it, and you would go broke, or at the very least, hit your bottom line.
Yeah, and it's always a question. Because frequently companies want to talk about, let's save money, less data. I always want to talk about better data. But better data gets to be tough when you have to start dropping it. And so
Yes.
this is where, for example, like compliance and retention, if you know it's a clear compliance and retention use case, straight to your Glacier. Don't even put it in your data lake. Don't even put it in your SIM. And so now you start seeing just real big chunks of data getting freed up. Large cloud data sets, Cloud Trail is a good example. Audit, Azure Audit, all the various flow logs. What are you really doing with that data as a detection use case? And typically not a lot. If you are, you're using very small subsets of that data. And so this is where having this classification pipeline is becomes so important. And I also I'm glad you brought this up in terms of automation. By tagging your data as it comes in, you can now build in the variabilization in your ingest pipeline, in your route tree, in your processing pipelines, and in your destination. That now makes you can start making changes with a lot less risk. I'm sure, Paul, do you have anything you want to share about that automate, downstream automation?
It's been my philosophy to try and go as hands off as possible, especially when you talk about things like the top level routes and the top level pipelines on that. Now, there's some use cases where there's kind of no way around that, but as a general principle for upgradability, for supportability, I prefer to move configurations off to lookup files, to variables, and processing into packs. And the same pack can actually be used for pre, primary, and post processing, depending on how you set up the routing table in that. So it certainly makes things more portable. And back to the example I gave earlier about the client that has 2 or 3 pages of routing, it's certainly going to simplify your routing tables. At a minimum, it saves you time once you go in and try to make a change on something.
Yep. It's a big deal, and it's really common because you're setting your filters you're setting your filter you're at a high granularity in arguably the wrong place. I think let's do this in another live stream where we start talking about packs and how you want to do your granular filtering in your packs and not in your top line route. Because I think that's another big place, because the biggest place where I see mistakes made is when you're making manual edits to your top line route tree, and
Yes.
especially when it's 2 3 pages long and it's all customized, because it's really hard to understand what's going on.
Absolutely. And something else you brought up is, that compliance requirement of sending that data off to Glacier. There may still be an observability value in it. There may still be a
Sure.
security value in it. But by tiering that, you can again send that full fidelity copy off to your Glacier. Then you can start shaping. Maybe that same event goes full send to the Glacier. A subset of it goes to a system of analysis for observability, and an even smaller subset then gets put into your SIM. And that way you're targeting and optimizing your spend across all of your properties.
Yeah, this is the thing I'll say till I'm blue in the face: matching cost and value.
Yep.
The value of the data has to match the cost you're putting into it. So I always think about, in terms of your SIM, $1 per gig all in is not unusual. 15 to 20 cents for a quality data lake, 3 to 5 cents somewhere in that area for object storage, and even less for Glacier.
Yep.
And so just look at the value of your data. And if the value of your data doesn't approach $1, then it goes to goes to your data lake. If it's not 15 or 20 cents a gig, then it goes somewhere else. Always match cost and value, because at the end of the day, as Paul very, very wisely mentioned, the business case, the business value is what matters. The business is not going to give you money if you're not providing value.
And you can't get where you want to go without knowing where you are. So step one is knowing the data, knowing the value, knowing how it's used downstream, and properly tagging it before you can cost match.
Absolutely. Hey, are you ready to take a look at your pipeline?
I absolutely am.
There you go. This is going to be cool. Paul does this really love how Paul has laid this out. So can you just kind of end to end start kind of going through it?
Absolutely. So we've got 3 data gens here, and just, I'll preface this with, this is all anonymized sample data out there. We're not showing anything live on this. So we've got 3 sources here. We've got a
Paul, we
web.
need some healthcare data in here.
I'm sorry.
We need some healthcare data in here.
Right. Yeah. Let me get on that for you. Um, it could be done. I'm just not going to do in this. So we have, say a web server, we've got a firewall, and then we've got a Linux host, syslog on here. So nothing really standard here. This would typically be, a syslog input, another syslog input, and, potentially a file input on here, but I, needed some stuff to play with. So for each of these, what we do is we tag it here with, or we send it through, a pre-processing pipeline. Now, for those that don't know, the pre-processing pipeline hits after the event breaker, but before it goes through the primary routing. And you can send it either to a top level, pipeline, or you can send it to a pack.
Paul, can I ask a quick question here? And
Absolutely.
so I think this is all from a preference, but I'm a big fan of putting this classification pipeline in pretty much every data source. Does that make sense for you, or is there times when you wouldn't do that?
Seeing as how this pipeline is simply analyzing the data and tagging it with metadata, I would put it on everything coming in. And you'll see later on, once we actually get to the routes and how that's working, is you can then control routing, alerting, searching on your data based upon whether or not it matched. But the only way you're going to know if it matched is if you send it through this pack, send it through this pipeline, and try to.
All right, thank you.
Absolutely. So you can see here that we have a single route for it all, and it goes through a pipeline. If we needed to potentially use different tagging methods. This is where we would do that based upon the shape. But I find that by structuring your, and this is going to end up going back to lookups tables, by structuring your lookup tables such that you account for all the different points that you would previously have put, say, maybe in a top level route. So think input ID, think source, think, port, think hex source, and things like that. By accounting for a wide array of that, you can simplify it and run into, well, at least so far, I haven't found anything that doesn't go through this pipeline. Setup, we're just going to create an object to hold our metadata here. Notice that we prefix this with the __. And we don't necessarily want this going downstream everywhere. Sometimes we do, and we have ways that we can then bring this back up to top level. Like if we were sending out, say, a metrics roll up to Cribl Lake to end up doing searches and dashboards against the efficacy and the tagging of it, we would absolutely want to bring that back to a top level field. But if the goal is to save data in your SIM and in your system analysis, you definitely don't want to expand the data that you're sending down.
Right.
So
At the end, when we talk about some governance compliance, I'll bring up why there are some reasons to keep some of the data as well. So, but please go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. This is where the bulk of the work happens. And you notice here that we run a chain of lookups. Now, at volume, at scale, you're going to be concerned about the performance of this and how much processing it's adding to it. Profiling this initially, it looks like we're adding about 1 millisecond per event that comes in. So it's certainly there with this entire pipeline, but it's very, very efficient, very, negligible. I'll go through some of these, but right now what we're just going to do is we're going to jump over here in the knowledge and lookups and look at it. This is your primary classifier. So it's going to try to match on input ID. Because these are regex matches, to wildcard it, you have to use the $* just to match any character. In this particular case for this tagging, we're actually running a regular expression against raw. If you know Palo data, you know that traffic, threat, global protect, hit match, they all tend to come in on that same port. We're going to tag it with a data type here, and we're going to tag it with an environment. These lookup tables are broken up because if they weren't, once we get into things like tagging the data owners on it or tagging the detections, you could end up having several dozen rows for each unique combination of tags versus breaking it out by, I would say, metadata domain allows you to keep these lookup tables smaller and ultimately do targeted updates on it that don't impact the rest of your systems. So if we bring up, say, detection mapping here, back to that data type, and we can match it by environment, and it's going to give you a detection ID. So for these things, it would be analogous to a detection in CrowdStrike Next-Gen SIEM, or maybe a correlation search in Splunk Enterprise Security, right? It's going to be that rule that you're matching downstream in your system of analysis. Looking at data owners, again, we're going to match on type and environment. Unsurprisingly, Palo is owned by the network team. The web logs are owned by the application teams and IT operations. If we jump back into our pipeline here, let's actually look at this in action. I don't know why it does that. So we're going to pull up this sample here of the Palo data and show our internal fields. Now you can see that metadata. So I can tell this event, if I were to do a live capture on it, if there's something wrong with this event, or if this feed goes dark, I need to contact NetOps. I know that this powers one detection, and I want to send this to my SIM and to my archive. It's in production. We see the owner there. To bring up an example of something that matches multiple detections, this is our web logs, right? So this is actually matching 2 detection rules. So we want to, brute force and access my disabled accounts on this. We are also sending this. Well, we're not sending this to our SIM. Probably should. We're sending it to our to an analysis and observability platform, as well as our archive. If we jump back up here to our top level routes, these 4 routes handle more or less everything, more or less everything that we're sending through it. So we know that we have a route to the SIM. We know that we have a route to a system of analysis. So, maybe a Prometheus Grafana on that. And we have a route to the archive. This one's actually configured with Cribl Lake. And we're looking for that metadata field to see if it includes the term archive. Notice
Can I ask
that
a
that
quick
was
question?
absolutely.
So routing by your metadata field, at least to me and my barely educated eyes, would be less overhead than trying to route by the contents of the data.
Absolutely.
Does that sound about right?
It really does, because you've got to think that you incur a processing expense every single time you go down. Now it's minuscule, but there is a processing expense every time you try to match against a filter rule.
Right. And so, and this is, and it again comes, and this is, I think the benefit is you change a lookup, you now update your routing table without having to touch the routing
Exactly.
table.
And you can do that if I go back to the pack, those were all excuse me, in memory lookups, and I did that because it's easier for the sake of this demo. If you were to change those to disk-based lookups, you could theoretically change your routing and everything without ever doing a commit back to your configurations.
And that to me, that is key because you're able to make very dynamic changes to your
Yes,
environment without having to really mess with your configs. And so this is why I think just lookups are just a really underrated way to scale and manage your data pipeline like Stream.
absolutely. A couple of key points on this. Notice that final is not set for these. If you remember, if you go back to the examples, we had, potentially multiple routes, some to the SIM and to archive, some to analysis and archive. So you want to make sure that you allow all of those through. But at the end of it, you want to make sure that if you have already routed it, that you get rid of it. So we're going to take all those events that were actually tagged with the meta route, and then we're going to drop them, because that means, and you can see here, that means it caught one of these three routes here. Now, if we had not matched at all, this would be undefined, and it would allow the event to continue down the routing table.
Just one note for anyone who's watching the stream, please ask questions. We are here to help. Paul, my limited ability to answer questions, we will answer your questions. So please don't be afraid to ask questions.
And for what it's worth, we're talking about stuff that a lot of people aren't doing yet. So it is, this kind of new territory on it. And again, happy to answer any questions that come up on
Yeah.
this.
And a lot of it we want to think about the why, and that's where we're mentioning about the ease of
Yes,
analysis. And just as simple, we'll say the last few minutes in terms of governance, because there's some really big governance things that you can cover by taking this approach. But please receive, Paul, and thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
no, absolutely. And I showed earlier, going through the pack, I showed a static example of that. Why don't we see this live? So let's look at our Palo data and let's capture that as it's coming in. In fact, let's get it before it hits the destination. That way we can see this in action. It's one thing to show something static. It's another thing to show it, as it's actually happening. Did I select 50 on that?
It's okay.
Okay, we've got 4 here. So if we go to our show internal fields, we can absolutely see that metadata being applied. We can see the route that's being applied to it. This particular event hit the output ID dev null. We should be able to see, there we go. So we can actually see the same event going to multiple destinations in here. If we were to capture at the destination, we would see that same thing coming in, but we'd only see that one copy of that data. I'm happy that worked. And you can also see here that we've applied some processing to it. So notice this has also gone through the Cribl Palo Alto pack. And that's just the one that's available on the dispensary. I think Brendan is the one who built that. And that tends to be kind of the gold standard in terms of processing. So for now, and this is where it makes sense to go back and use a top level pipeline. I don't know what I changed on that, so I'm going to discard it. If we look at our SIM processing, we can then use a single top level pipeline to then chain it back into the correct processing pack. Another cool thing that's come of this is you start to run into ways to do things better, and you start to run into limitations of Cribl. Not trying to be disparaging, every software has limitations on that. I've actually put a feature request in to allow you to maybe click into an advanced mode and be able to set this as a variable. That way you could go back to your tagger and tag the pack you want it to go through, and then with a single pipeline, match on that and send it through the proper pack if it's been installed on it. But for now, we can just do it with chaining. I know with destinations like CrowdStrike Next Gen SIM, you don't have one input to rule them all. So that's where you tie it to then an output router, and you match the, whatever filter criteria you wanted, and then you can send it to that CrowdStrike HEC input based upon your metadata and your tagging. So you have effectively, with 3 pipelines, 4 or 5 routes or whatnot in a single pack, you have completely automated end to end from the source to the destination, your routing and processing.
Like you mentioned, for destinations that have to have custom setups like CrowdStrike Next Gen
Yes.
SIM, where you have to put multiple hack endpoints
Mhm.
and essentially have your hack endpoint round robin, your hack output router round robin among those destinations. It gives you that flexibility to
Absolutely.
especially hit the right data, hit that output. I mean that destination, but also then tier your data into your data lake and whatnot. So it's just flexibility is everything.
Absolutely. Some more advanced implementations of this, if you notice, back to the pack on here, the detections, at least the detection lookup was static. So, some ways that this can be expanded is to then take these detections and to have these updated external to Cribl. So some type of connection or pulling back into say CrowdStrike to pull a list of all possible detections, or an API call back into Splunk to pull all of the correlation rules that are enabled, and keeping this up to date. Now, of course, you would still have to go in and tag the data that's coming to this. So that's going to be, I think, the detection mapping, right? But at a minimum, you know that you've got your detection IDs pre-populated, and it minimizes the number of things you need to manually keep updated.
Have a customer, for example, what they'll do is they'll write a data gen for every detection, so that way
Mhm.
they can recreate it. And
Yep.
then what they do is they map the data gen map to the ID to the SIM, and so
Nice.
creates a nice, clean way to validate and a very packaged way to validate their detection. So they have a classification pipeline, detection pipeline, and whatnot. And
Nice.
so you can very carefully then start expanding your program. This is also a good way from a detection standpoint that you can then also route through an enrichment pipeline,
Right.
so that you can say, hey, this detection, we're going to drive it off of this threat intel feed. So this threat intel feed is going to then sit on this data and then do lookups as a way to then, and this is where I'm starting to see some nice trends in terms of mapping the detection in the stream. For example, if I get a hit on this threat intel feed, I'm going to start my case investigation process right from stream.
Right.
And so and this is where, just by mapping that data together, you now start to get a very repeatable, very agile way to examine your data, and then start finding really interesting things about your data. Ask questions of your data differently.
Exactly. I mentioned earlier that you could, as part of this pipeline, you could do a metrics roll up and look at the number of events, and you can look at, say, the number of fields or whatnot by those metadata fields, and send that off to your data lake that you can then search against it and very, very quickly visualize. And talking about mapping that and having a solid end-to-end detection testing, I bet it's very easy for that client to tell when a detection rule changes whether or not a data set is still needed anymore.
Exactly. And this is that the governance issues that, so in this, governance quickly starts to be an issue. This is something I spend a lot of times with teams talking about. Data in the IT and the security space is inherently volatile. So, because unfortunately, too, it's like I onboard the data, then I forget about it, and you cannot do that. And this is why this is where starting to surface metadata tagging actually in your system analysis starts to get really important. Because can you go back to the top line route?
Absolutely.
And so this is where it's important to start looking at, where is my data going. So very at the very end, for example, if none of your routes at the top match, then it goes to your default destination. So I've heard teams call this purgatory. I've heard them call this this is like the I mean, it was a bad word, but it's basically just a place where unknown data went to. And so this is an example. If it's not matching, something's wrong. You
Right.
have data that you don't know about, data that has changed. And to have a process where, and this is where, for example, my team, I'd have my overnight team looking at this data, and if they could understand it and fix it, they would, or then they'd create a ticket and hand it off to the morning engineer. So the morning engineer then take a look, try to understand, just where did this come from? Why is it there? Should it be there in the first place? And then take action appropriately, as a constant feedback loop of, there's something we don't understand, and this
Yep.
and this is, and then feed it back into, okay, this is something we care about, we're going to feed it back into the classification pipeline, and it gives yourself a nice feedback loop. This also gives you the ability to go into your system analysis and start understanding, what are we using versus what are we not using. Like, for example, you mentioned the detection data. Are we running detections on data that's not tagged? Because this is where, for example, in your system of analysis, you run your data for stuff that has no metadata on it. You
Yep.
start looking for your data, like data that's not tagged for the pipeline. This is, for example, you mentioned you had the pipeline tagged onto it. So if it didn't go through a pipeline, where did it come from? Because
Exactly.
And this is how you find these incremental issues of classification, matching, and data quality. But it's incredibly important that it's part of your everyday work processes in order to understand these questions. Because if you don't, things start to get out of hand. And just it all goes back to we're dealing with data sets that are fundamentally volatile, and most teams don't have control over their data owners, over their data sources.
Yep.
And so this is where it's really important to have a set of controls in place. So Paul, when you work with teams, what's typical? So hey, they see a problem. What do you recommend they do when they see a problem? Because I mean, I know what I recommend, but I was you know more than I do.
It's really going to depend on what that problem is. So, before I jump into that, I want to
Sure.
touch on something. You mentioned that you called it the data purgatory catch all. There's a number of
Yeah.
names for it. If you remember, when we were backstage, we were actually talking about a data issue that I was trying to troubleshoot before this for a client. And the way we were able to tell there was an issue in the first place is because the catch all on that does not drop it. It sends it off to a Cribl Lake data set that we
Right.
can then look and catch those data issues. So, that's the way that we were able to catch it in the first place. As far as how do you troubleshoot data, the step one is you want to make sure that it's properly going through the expected routes, the expected processes in Cribl. And if it's not, then it's likely a routing or processing issue. And tagging with metadata is a solid way of doing that because you can look at the end of the line and see, is it properly tagged? If not, it's very likely somewhere in your Cribl setting. Then look at your system of, do a capture in Cribl, look at your system of analysis, try to determine if there's parity there, if you capture before the destination and going into the system of analysis. If it's weird stuff like what I talked about earlier, open a support case.
Yeah, totally. And those are the things you do, and that's how you find out what's going on. And so, and I appreciate you mentioning what you were struggling with because I think troubleshooting techniques are important for everybody. You know, beginner, whether you've been doing this forever, the only difference is just the magnitude of how weird it is. But otherwise,
Yep.
everyone struggles, and this is understanding your data is how you now understand what's going wrong and tracing things down. So in terms of just wanted to say, from a governance standpoint, the thing I always encourage is use this as a feedback loop to have someone else track down data owners. If you are the system analysis, the ingest team owner, you are not going to be in a position to have an effective relationship to stop data owners from doing dumb things. And so this is where it's really important. If you have a GRC team, use it. If you have someone else surface these issues and have a continuous program of being able to do something about it. But this is key. Like data owners are everything. This is where a lot of teams what they'll do is they'll take a daily download from say a CMDB or ServiceNow or something like this as a way to manage this process. And this is why just enrichment with lookups is a super underrated way to shift toward better data, not just less data.
Yep, absolutely. And we talked about earlier about automating the pulls and updates of those detection rules. If you do have a solid CMDB, you can pull that data directly in as well. And then you just match it based upon your host. Or
Exactly.
tag it if it's Windows, your whatever workstation in there is reporting, right? You'd have different ways of doing that. But you can even automate the maintenance of that CMDB.
Yeah, so one thing, and this is where Paul alluded to it earlier. Cribl is rereading the lookups very rapidly, and this is why you can update the lookup and not have to touch the code, not have to restart anything. So this is just lookups are a great way to to give you agility to make changes to your system.
And anyone who's run a system at scale is going to be very, very sensitive to processing, is going to be very, very sensitive to the overhead. I know I talked about
Right.
that this doesn't really add a lot to it, but we can see here exactly what is added for 50 events. This one's even more efficient than the Palo was. You've got 5 milliseconds, excuse me, across 50 events. That's pretty damn efficient.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why, to me, this is a good example of a good trade off.
Yep, exactly. The value, back to your cost matching for data processing, cost matching right here.
Right.
Absolutely. Is what is that, 0.1 millisecond per event
Yep.
for automating your routing, for knowing with certainty how your data is being used, where it's going, and where to go if it breaks. Absolutely worth it.
Very cool. Yeah, just this is also one thing I just thought about. We're starting to work with a team on building some UEBA use cases, and so because what we're gonna do with the data for UEBA is we're gonna do a lot of aggregation. So the idea is we want to get a sense over 6 months the behavior of several hundred thousand employees.
Yep.
So this is where 1 minute aggregates of behavior. So for example, VPN logins, access through a firewall,
Yep.
access through a proxy. So where we're going to aggregate. So we're going to use a classification pipeline like this to route a copy of data over to a separate worker group that's going to handle, because the aggregation use cases take up a lot more resources. So they're going to build this. They're going to build 1 minute aggregates and put this into a separate system. So now they can essentially give me a baseline for all 200,000 employees and show me who's two standard deviations off the baseline. And so it's another good example of how this can really matter.
You brought up something really good there, and that
Yeah.
is segregating worker groups based upon the amount of load that they're putting on it.
Mhm.
So I mentioned and I showed that you could chain certain things and get primary processing, and I showed chaining going through the Cribl Palo Alto's pack. It is completely feasible to have a single worker group that takes care of your tagging and your classification, and then sends out to different worker groups based upon the expense and the level of processing required to get it to the destination. Which brings me to one more quick thing I wanted to show about the pack. And that is, we're looking here and we had our metadata as an internal field. Well, all it takes is going over here and changing one variable. This one I feel comfortable doing live. And now if we go back to that pipeline, we have now promoted that internal field to a top level field. So if we wanted to send it between worker groups, to your point about there being value in sending some of this data downstream, if we wanted to send it downstream, now we're doing that.
That's awesome. Thank you for bringing that up. So I hope is anyone we're going to have to close out pretty soon. Is anyone listening have any questions? Please let us know. If not, both Paul and I are also in the Cribble community, and this is just real important concepts. We just hope people just get why this idea of knowing your data is so important. And what Paul's pipeline is a brilliant example of how, I mean, Paul's pack is a brilliant example of how to add this classification data. And we talk about why it's important in terms of governance, in terms of control, in terms of automation, and the idea of you always want to talk about how can we provide our teams better data to solve problems. Paul, do you have anything you want to close out with? And then I'm going to talk about CriblCon.
It's just going to be that CriblCon. You led with. I'm with VisiCore Tech. We've got a booth at CriblCon. We've got some what I think are pretty cool announcements coming out there. So if you're at CriblCon, and Ed, I'm pretty sure you're about to share the details, please stop by, say hi to us. If maybe you're watching this and some questions came up, great time to ask them. That's only just a little over a week away. So we'll be there, and if you're there, we'd love to meet.
Yeah, Paul's from VisiCore just did not go into what a great job they do with our customers. Just a trusted partner to help teams just get value from their tools. We're not talking about massive engagements for too much money that deliver too little value. Paul's guys get stuff done, and it's
Thank
great
you.
to see. I really appreciate it. Now on to CribbleCon. Yep, so you have to have the leader, Mike Dupuis. CribbleCon. There you go, Mike. We really appreciate it. So please join us for CribbleCon. It's going to be in National Harbor, Maryland, October 13th to the 15th. We're going to have a full day of training and 2 full days of presentations of no marketing speak allowed. The salespeople will be, have socks stuffed into their mouth. They're there to buy drinks, not to sell things. But we're here to help. We're here just to educate, and we're looking forward to meeting everybody. Just I think really excited. So I can't wait. I can't wait for it, and I'll be seeing Paul there for sure. All right. Well, look, oh, I see a comment. Let's see. There we go. J.R. Murray. Hey, J.R. How you doing there? So Paul's asking if the pack is on Git or somewhere else to reference.
We don't have this somewhere out there yet. Keep them, as we demonstrate on here, this is really built with sample data and kind of mock-ups and proofs of concept. But once we have something a little more solid, we'll see what we can do about putting this framework out there.
Yeah, I'm gonna see what I can do to harass Jr. to come in on the live stream too.
Nice. Yeah, thanks for coming, JR.
I appreciate it, Jr. Let's see. There we go. So I think we're done for the day. Paul, thank you very much. I think this is really informative. This is brilliant work. I love how you explain this, and I look forward to seeing everyone at CribbleCon.
Thanks for having me, Ed. We'll see you there.
Absolutely. Hey, okay, hey, we've got to do this again soon. Take care and thank you.
Thank you.